finally got that off. Alright, so I finally got this center section apart, but if you look right there, that is a heat shield and that's the lip that it seats on, and it's made out of cast iron, so it gets corroded. And then there's the opposite side. So when I put it back together, I'm going to use anti-seize so that it doesn't stay together like that anymore. But if you look, let's see. Okay, so yeah, here's the heat shield. You see it's separate, and then the wheel, and it spins good. I mean, I know I need new bearings, but I didn't dent any of the fins or bend them when I pulled the housing off this time. So I did make a little bit of a goof, and I broke that. And I'm going to tell you how I broke it, so you guys don't make the same mistake. But I seen a video on YouTube where a guy put a bolt between this backing plate right here and this thing to like spread them apart, and I did that and it cracked the housing. So don't try that. It doesn't work. Just I called the shop and asked them how they got them off, and I was using this hammer right here. So I was using this, which is a 1 pound rubber faced dead blow. He said that's not gonna work. You need to get a 2 pound metal faced dead blow. So that's what I did, and if you look at the front, you can see it's pretty banged up. It's like a soft metal, so it doesn't do too much damage to what you're hitting. And it's a dead blow hammer. So sure enough, that worked. I got it off. There doesn't look to be any damage on the turbo. So yeah, I broke that, but there's a good thing to this, is I went on eBay and I found a new one, and it has an O-ring on it. So this makes them so that servicing these turbos is easier, because this had RTV on it when I first pulled it off, and you had to hammer this top housing off as well to break the RTV, and that's how you bend fins, and I bent a fin when I did that. So now this is an O-ring seal, so if I ever have to service it again, I can just remove it and it's not going to be a struggle to get it off, and it seals good. I don't have to put more RTV on it. It's just kind of an easier system. So I got this new backing plate. It was only $30. The rebuild kit was $30. So I seen other people saying that you could you can like mark these and you know, realign them and balance them and stuff like that. But I was looking at mine, and my wheel is ground for balancing, and so is the nut. So I'd have to get the nut exactly lined up with the wheel, and the wheel exactly lined up with the other wheel. So it's just gonna be a pain. Called the turbo shop when I was talking to them about the hammer to use, and they said it was only $50 to rebalance a turbo. So for 50 bucks, I'm gonna get it perfect balance. And if turbos are out of balance, they spin at like 26,000 RPMs and higher. Like, they spin really fast. So if they're a little bit out of balance, you know, they're gonna rattle themselves apart, and you're gonna be rebuilding the turbo in, you know, no time. So for 50 bucks, I'm gonna be assured that the turbo is perfectly balanced, and it's gonna run good. It's gonna make more power than it would if I just slapped it together. It's gonna last longer. So that's the name of the game. So getting the housing off of the exhaust is the hardest part about this rebuild. So now I can continue to tear it apart and put all the new bushings and stuff like that in there. Alright, so I went a little bit ahead. I took this nut off. It's reverse thread, so it's righty loosey, lefty tighty, if that makes any sense. Let me see. It's a really tiny 12.7 millimeter, but your turbo, if you're doing a different turbo, is probably different. Once you take that off, and if you want to try to not have this balanced again, you can mark it and stuff, but I would recommend getting it balanced, because my quote was only $50 to balance this turbo, and then it's perfectly balanced. So now you can pull off the impeller, and if you look at that, it's nice, clean, and then I already did this, so but I want to give you a look at it. So you pull this apart and that's a whole lot of nasty, like carbon, oil, I don't know exactly what it is. But once you pull that apart, you have your exhaust turbine and this heat shield comes off. I'll probably clean that up. But then yeah, you got, it looks like one of the bearings came off with it, but that's your bearings. It's not spinning very well. And then washer, I don't know what that is, but all this stuff's getting replaced, so we'll just clean up what's going back in, and then we can start putting it back together with the new parts. Alright, so I got a wire wheel and I cleaned up all that carbon buildup. It was really thick. I don't know exactly what it was, but it just kind of looked like grease or something. Kind of alarming, but we'll figure it out. So I cleaned that up with a wire wheel, and now I'm going to take off this front housing so I could access some of the other stuff. More hammering. Ouch. So, let's get a close look for me and you so when I put it back together. So, looks like there's a little bit of RTV or something. And then there's this little part. So that was in there. It's like a little clip and a round deal. Alright, so I was just checking to make sure that the parts are the same. They look the same. Tops look the same, minus this one has an O-ring. So everything looks good. So now if you look in the cold side of the center section, there's this little plate, which I believe is the same thing as that plate, 3 bolts. So there's little tiny Torx bits, so I'm going to pull those out now. Okay, so these small things are T10 Torx bits. And I fucking stripped my thing out. And that's how it's done right there. See, I just cut a slit into the head with a Dremel bit, and then I put a flathead screwdriver in it. So that's kind of a trick if you don't have an extractor. Just make it flathead and then it comes out pretty easy. So I'm going to do that to this last one right here. You can see they're the same. You know, this is an eBay rebuild kit, so I'm just kind of going through and making sure everything looks the same. So far so good. Everything seems to be identical. Very, very identical. So we'll just keep doing that and keep on tearing this thing down. Okay, so it looks like we got a washer on top. Alright, the thin bronze washer with the grooves in the front. I think what's after this is the last journal bearing. Yeah, so there's the other journal bearing. There's not too bad of wear on these guys, but enough. Alright, so now I got all the parts cleaned up. I'm going to start doing the reassembly with the new rebuild components. So the first part to go in is going to be this guy, and there's one hole on it, and that hole has to face this opening when it's inserted into the center core thingy. Just got the center thing started on the bench vise, and I'm going to try to finish it off with this C-clamp. So I got it a little bit more in with that, and I kind of got it to where it could go. I need to get something else to press this in that fits in that space with the washer. It looks like this socket will work, so I'm going to go back outside to the bench vise and press it in a little bit further with this socket. So I got the center thing in. It's just kind of a long, tedious process. Let me see. It was just pressing. I'm trying to get the light in there without. So okay, there you go. So do you see that hole? There's like a square where that hole is. I just had to press it in with a series of sockets until I seen that the circle is fully in that opening there. So that's all you have to do for that center part. It's quite a bit of force required to press it in. So a hammer wouldn't work, so I had to use the bench vise. So now that I got that center part in, I'm going to put my attention to this. In this groove right here, this bottom groove, there is a, I think this is the oil seal for the turbo. So it looks like a little tiny piston ring. It's got a little opening. That's the turbo seal. So I'm going to put the new turbo seal on the turbine. Alright, so there, as you can see that the little ring's on there. That's where it's supposed to go. New turbo oil seal ring. And then the other thing, so if you remember this part inside this housing, so in order to hold this piece in, you can see that there's another one of those rings on the tip. So I'm gonna grab the new one of these parts and put that ring on it. So here's the new part and the new ring. So I'm gonna try to put this on without blocking the camera too much. Yep, that's that easy. Alright, so here's the old one compared to the new one. And if I take it in for a closer look, you can see that the heights are the same. They both spin freely, so it looks like everything's gonna work out alright. So I think now the journals are good to go in. I'm just gonna make sure they're the same one real quick. Okay, now the good thing about this sticky stuff is that it'll hold the parts in place too. Especially with something like this where everything is small and not necessarily press fit to stay in. So I'm almost ready for the shaft to go back in. So we have this washer right here, and that goes on first. That washer sits on there like that with the spiky prong parts contouring this wheel right here. And then after that I can lube up this shaft and stick it in with the journal bearings. The one that goes in after is this guy. So it's like the bronze with the notches in it. That goes on at this point. That looks seated all the way. Let me give you a close up. You can see that is in there like so. Now I'm going to lube up this a little bit. Try not to make too much of a mess with this assembly lube. And now that fat washer goes on. Like so. After the flat washer, we got to put this plate back on. So here's the new plate. When I showed you, it looks just like the old one. Oh, there we go. Just looks just like the old one. So, gotta put this on. We got new bolts. So, now the new bolts, a little bit of innovation. They got a little bit of red Loctite on them. But I don't think you're going to be able to see this, but they're Allen key. Oh yeah, you can see it. They're Allen key instead of Torx bits this time. So they're not going to strip out when you try to remove them. So I got this P-Tex Ultra Copper High Temp silicone gasket maker. So I just had this laying around, but I know this will be good. This will work for what I need. So I'm probably just going to do a couple ooga-doogas on these and that should be fine. Put this housing on, it's tight enough. Now all I need to do is put this the wheel on. So now there's 0 shaft play. That's how it's supposed to spin. Smooth and got no shaft play at all. So this turbo, once it's balanced, will be ready to go for many, many miles. So I'll be back once this gets balanced and then we could reassemble the turbo. I got the turbo back from the shop. I also got this new light, very bright. So I got a lot more light now, but yeah, I got this turbo balance from the turbo shop, and it spins good, a lot smoother than it did before. I had an issue with one of the thrust washers in here, wasn't pressed in enough, so it was binding up. So I just had to take it apart, press it back in further, and it was good to go. So now all I have to do is put the cold side and the hot side back on, and I'm going to put a little bit of anti-seize on the hot side so that it doesn't seize up like it did before, because it was like a week-long process of getting that off. Okay, so this gap you see right there, you can see a little bit of the anti-seize in there. It's all sealed up perfectly now. So now I can go ahead and get this I think you would call this a V-band as well. It's kind of a similar idea, styled clamp. So now that we got the back side on, we can start putting the cold side together. And it's important that you know how this is going to be clocked so that you can get it right. The wastegate also helps you kind of figure out where it's clocked, because the wastegate only goes on one way. Turbo's all together now. The last step, I guess, as far as the turbo goes, is I'm going to replace this bolt. So if you don't know, Subaru turbos use a banjo bolt. Pretty much everything on the oil feed system for Subarus is banjo bolt style filters. I'm going to pull this bolt out. This is, you know, your typical banjo bolt for your oil feed, and then I will replace it with this right here. So I'm going to replace it with this. This is a AN styled fitting with the same thread as this old banjo bolt. So this is the part number, and it's a Russell. That's the part number. So I just took one of the old crush washers and put it on this fitting, and we're just gonna thread this guy in there. And I'll get a wrench to tighten that down. So that's what a banjo bolt looks like, and usually there's a filter that goes inside there, and you see that hole is what, you know, works together with this. Let's see, yeah, so that goes in there like so, and it oils it that way. Okay, so I figure I'll show you now. So you see that I put that fitting on there, and here's a stainless steel AN line that goes to a TurboSmart inline oil filter, which comes down to another braided steel AN line and goes into another fitting like this that threads into a sandwich plate, and this goes in between the block and the oil filter. So instead of having the oil feed from the block, it's going to feed directly from the oil filter, so it's going to get a much more consistent supply of oil, and with the filter it's going to keep it from getting contaminated. So you'll hear about that oil feed system a bit more in the future once I'm installing the turbo onto the car, but if you want to know the components and the part numbers for the stuff that's on it, go to bnrsupercar.com and click on their turbo section for the Legacy GT's turbos, and there will be like a link in there that'll say oil bypass kit, and that has like a list of all the parts that you need. That's where I got all these part numbers from. Ordered it. I think the feed system's maybe $100 with all the parts, but it'll make sure that your turbo lasts, and these cars have a big problem with oil starvation in the turbos, and you don't want to go through a turbo, so the $100 for upgraded oiling system is way better than spending $1,200 on a new turbo when you blow yours up from oil starvation.